All right, let's go ahead and turn in our Bibles tonight to 1 Timothy chapter number 5. The book of 1 Timothy chapter 5, and we continue to see Paul's instruction regarding the responsibility that the church has towards the care of the widows. And I want to ask you a question. I'm going to get you to turn to 1 Timothy 5, and I don't want you to do two things at the same time. But once you get there, put your thinking cap on just for a moment. We'll try not to barge into your brain for too long. But if someone were to come and ask you for help, financial assistance, whatever it might be, what are some of the standards that you might use to determine whether or not you would grant them their request? Any ideas? Okay, what are they going to do with it? Okay, are they going to waste it? Are they going to put it to good use? What's another thing? Their character. Are they the type of person that we think we might want to support? What else? What are they doing to help themselves? And there ought to be some of that responsibility. Anything else? Okay, do they have family? Did you say how they smell? Okay, so if they smell good, you're going to give them money? Okay, smell like they're drunk, that's one thing. I was going to say, everybody go get a bottle of cologne and hit Nathan's bank account, and it'll work out great. We'll all be rich. You know, if you smell alcohol coming from their breath, you're probably not going to be too inclined to give them a whole lot of money. Okay, anything else? Yeah, it already is full. So there is a case where obviously someone is attempting to give some sort of a scam. Anything else quickly? Most of the things that we have suggested are subjective by their nature. The truth is, we can look at someone and really not be able to determine whether they actually need it or not. There are so many scam artists out there that will dress up in clothes that would make someone appear to need something. But the reality is we would have very little ability to discern whether or not they would need it. You could also look at how they might use those resources. And once again, something going to be extremely subjective. In our minds, our hope would be that they would use these resources in a manner that is going to be beneficial to them and perhaps to those maybe they are trying to provide for. One that would be a little bit more objective would be, do they have family? And is there another resource that they might have? And again, we're still going to be relying on their honesty. We might look at someone that we suspect we have perhaps some sort of an alcohol smell, for example. Now, it could just be that they drank way too much Listerine, and they're having that challenge. But the issue still is going to be, we're looking at a person and we're making evaluations. Let's say it that way. And these evaluations, by their nature, are oftentimes subjective. And so Paul in 1 Timothy 5 is giving instruction that is going to give a little bit more objective evaluation for us to look at. Because what he is dealing with in verses 3 through 16 is how the church is to care for the widows and what responsibility do they have in doing so. I would suggest that the amount of material that Paul devotes to this particular matter would suggest that this was probably something that needed attention. In fact, as we'll study tonight, some of what they were doing was actually, Paul actually directed them to stop doing it. There was a corrective sense in which they were not doing things wisely. And so I think that there was, at least to an extent, a problem, and Paul, in writing, sought to establish some guidelines that would give a system of order and direction. And so Paul, as he is developing this relationship towards the widows, we've already seen that he needed to assess the need with discernment, verses 3 through 8. And the idea behind that was, is she a widow indeed? In other words, is she one that is truly desolate, or are there other family members that ought to care for her? Obviously, if there are children or grandchildren, the Bible uses the term nephews, but we would understand it to be equivalent to grandchildren. If there are children and grandchildren, they have a responsibility as well as an honor, as we studied last week, to requite their parents, to repay that which has already been invested in them. Paul now continues, and he says in verses 9 through 13, to enforce the qualifications with consistency. And this is going to be a little bit more of the challenge. In fact, I'm going to change this outline and ask, the point's going to change. I didn't realize I typed it on that point on that out slide as well. But assist the qualified with compassion is where it's actually going to be. But nonetheless, on verses 9 and 10, there are some individuals who are going to be qualified for this, and there are some who are not. So, before I get into this, I want you to notice, though, the purpose of qualifications. Why do we have to have qualifications? So it's important to understand why these things are there. There's a negative reason and there's a positive reason. These qualifications negatively are not intended to create division or rivalry among social classes. Remember, we looked at in 1 Timothy 3, qualifications for a deacon and a pastor. That does not mean that these individuals are on a different plane socially and everyone else is down here. We're not going to take the treatment with these widows and suggest that now we're going to have two different classes of society and establish some sort of a rivalry or a contention between them as though they were of different value. That's not the purpose of these things at all. Instead, however, what we would say is positively, these qualifications were intended to establish a standard that ultimately would provide both guidance and consistency. Paul is writing and saying, okay, well, who do we have this responsibility to? It's important for us to not just look at everything from a subjective standpoint. I would have wondered if one of the methods that we would use to test things would be whether or not we like that particular person. If it's someone we like, we're typically more prone to give them assistance. If it is someone we dislike, we typically are not prone to give them assistance. It's why caller ID comes in so handy sometimes on our phone. We look at that person, I'm busy now. We've all done it, and you don't have to sit there and pretend as though you've never done this kind of thing. But the tendency is we will help those we like and those we may not like, or those we may not perceive to somehow that we're going to gain from them. Well, we're oftentimes much slower to help. If there's a benefit to me in helping that person, tragically, that's many people's standard that they're going to use as a standard by which to determine whether or not they're going to help. And so Paul gives these guidelines, and he does so to establish a guidance and to establish consistency. There's structure and there is order and consistency now across the board. So that leads us then, as he assists the qualified with compassion, understand the purpose of qualifications. Number 2, enforce the qualifications now with consistency. Notice what he says. Verse number 9, let not a widow be taken into the number under 80 years old, having been the wife of one man, well reported of for good works, if she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers, if she have washed the saints' feet, if she have relieved the afflicted, if she have diligently followed every good work. There are qualifications that Paul is going to give in these 2 verses that Paul expects to be enforced with consistency. Let not a widow be taken. It's actually a command that would imply action that was ongoing and it needed to stop. They were making a selection regarding widows and whether or not they were to be included into this group needing support. And Paul says, okay, you need to stop some practices. There are certain widows that are not simply eligible for this help. Now, that may ruffle someone's feathers, but that is just simply the reality that here are individuals who are not qualified for this level of support. And so Paul says, let not a widow be taken under, and then he begins to give this list. So stop allowing this widow to be taken who is under these or does not meet these certain qualifications. 1 Timothy 5, now beginning verse number 9. Here's the first qualification. There is an age requirement. 80 years, it has to be at least under, cannot be under 80 years old. You cannot take and regard a widow as necessary to receive this support who is under 60 years old. Now, we can look at that and say, well, my goodness, how did Paul come up with that? Did Paul just sit there and come up with a random number that says, let's see, what should the age be? Let's just make it 60. Now, what happens if she is 2 days before her 60th birthday? You can determine how literal you want to take this, okay? I do think that there is a sense in which it may not necessarily be 60 to the exact same day. 59 and a half might be acceptable, but regardless, there's a principle that's going to be here. Why would we say, do not take this widow into this category of those needing assistance who is under 60 years old? Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it would ensure the integrity of the assistance by granting it to those who were truly in need. The older widows, and you'll see this as we move on through the passage, are the ones who are most likely not going to remarry. They would be naturally, the circumstances for them would not change. Does that mean they couldn't remarry? Absolutely not. If they chose to remarry, they would not, however, do so whimsically. The younger widows, he's going to give instruction beginning in verse 11, to actually refuse because their desire for marriage is going to preempt their commitment. So you're going to run into problems with them. If an older one, let's say over 60, decides she's going to remarry, most likely she's not going to do so whimsically. I also think that it's fairly safe to say that a lady, unless she's by the name of Sarah, is probably beyond childbearing years at the age of 60. So we're not going to have that factor come in where take a 30-year-old widow, for example, and now she ends up expecting a child. Guess what? The church now doesn't have the same responsibility. You see how the thing begins to complicate itself. So he says any widow under 60 years of age was not to be included within the group of widows that were selected to receive assistance from the church. Let not a widow under 80 years of age be taken into this number. Here's another requirement. There's an age requirement. Secondly, there's a moral requirement. The Bible says that she is to having been the wife of one man. And interesting, the construction is the exact mirror image of what was stated regarding the pastor and the deacon in 1 Timothy chapter 3. It was there where the Bible says they are to be the husband of one wife. We saw that phrase to literally mean they were to be a one-woman man. Paul's qualification for this widow literally would read, she is to be a one-man woman. Now, is she permitted to remarry in God's sight? Absolutely she is. But a widow who had more than one husband most likely would not be in financial need of assistance. Her needs probably would be different. So the church would not be obligated to financially support her. But I also think the phrase goes a little bit further than that and would suggest the idea of referring to her moral integrity. Let me throw this example out. While she was married to her husband, if she were flirtatious with every other man, do you think she is fitting to receive this kind of support? I don't think so. Well, what if her husband dies and now she is loose morally? I would say again, she's disqualified from receiving this assistance. So while married to her husband, she was to be faithful to him in every aspect of their marriage. And even after he died, that does not give her a freedom to be loose morally, but a woman who was to be supported by the church I believe what Paul is saying here is to be one who is characterized by moral integrity, part of which would include in this particular case that she only having been married to one husband, because her financial picture would be most likely different if she were married to more than one. Thirdly, there is also a lifestyle requirement, and this is the bulk of the instruction that we find in verse number 10. She is to be well reported of for good works. The words well reported of would suggest that she would be known for and she would be spoken of favorably. She was to be known favorably for being engaged in good works, in activity that was both noble and praiseworthy. Now, we're not saying that this is merely a suggestion. This is a mandate. She has to be looked at when it comes to how she chose to live her life. And let's just take a quick time out here and say, incidentally, that individuals are known publicly by the way we choose to conduct ourselves. That's how we're known. We call it our testimony. Tragically, there are far too many professing believers who are content to be known by things that are dishonoring to God. Well, that's just who I am. Well, the Bible is very clear that you're to change who you are. Okay? In fact, I would probably take this a step further and say that if you are content to be known for things that dishonor God and are unmoved by it, I would suggest what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5, that you examine yourselves whether ye be in the faith. Amen. That's not a hallmark of a Christian. But as believers, our goal ought to be known, or ought to be such that we strive to be known by the right things. Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify whom? Your Father which is in heaven. Our life is to be lived in such a way that even the unsaved point to God. What a challenge. Each one of us has areas we know need to be improved. The difference between the believer and the unbeliever is the level of contentment that's there. As a believer, you can't live a life that is dishonoring to God and just simply get away with it. I also think that it's important to assess or to note that this is God's assessment of a person's works. She's known favorably for good works. Who's to determine what's good? God. You see, God takes note of the nature of her works, and God regards them as good. Typically, man has a much different standard by which works are evaluated. Unsaved people, if you ask them if they are a good person, generally will say yes. However, God's assessment of his good works are described in Isaiah chapter 64 and verse 6 as nothing but filthy rags. God's assessment is obviously much different. So regardless of how man may define something, what we're acknowledging is that God says this lady's works are good. Now, man may say something is good, but let me assure you that if God doesn't regard it as good, it's not good. Okay? Logic, I know, but we tend to sometimes kind of ignore or take for granted more the obvious types of things. And so as believers, we need to strive to engage only in that kind of activity that God defines as being good. Now, Paul then provides a list of examples of good works. Her good reputation was to have been evident by the way in which she acted. And each time there's this word if. If she does this, if she does that. It is a word that suggests something that is assumed true for sake of discussion. Furthermore, each of the things that she does took place in the past and established a lifestyle by which she made a conscious decision to engage in these activities. This was who she was. What type of widow or what type of lady was this? If she have brought up children, she was to have provided for the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual care for children. Does that mean that a childless widow is automatically disqualified? It can't, okay? Couple of reasons. She could have exhibited that kind of care for orphans. She could have exhibited that kind of care for other children. I've known many ladies whom God did not bless with their own children, but they still had the heart of a mother, and you couldn't take that away from them. Okay? Some of the ladies who've taught Sunday school classes maybe never had children, but yet those kids in there were her children. Same thing with school teachers. You find that kind of thing evident. There's a natural propensity that a lady is going to have towards that. But also you need to realize that the presence of children would negate her need for assistance based on Paul's early instruction. If she's got children, they're the ones responsible for it. But what if those children don't accept that responsibility? You see? Yes, they should, and Paul rebukes them severely for not. But if they're not willing to fulfill their responsibility, I still think the church would have the responsibility to help her if her children refuse to do so. If her children refuse to do so, there are some very strong words for her in verse number 8, or for those children in verse 8. They are worse than an infidel. That's not a compliment by any stretch of the imagination. Let me also point out it could be that the children already passed. Do you remember Naomi? Lost her husband as well as her 2 children in the book of Ruth. If she have brought up children. So it comes to the matter of child rearing. Typically what most parents think is, well, I've provided for my children by giving them physically what they need. Now, physical needs play a definite role, but the reality is children have emotional needs and children have spiritual needs as well. To effectively rear children then recognizes the necessity of seeking to meet all of those needs and rear these children in a God-honoring way. A qualifying widow has to be known for being engaged in this kind of activity, in the entire well-being of a child, not just simply providing candy for them. Okay, it's got to entail a whole lot more. Secondly, she must also have lodged strangers. Now the context, in the cultural context in which these believers lived, demanded the exercise of hospitality. Travel conditions in Paul's day were far from ideal and often included great danger. Luke chapter 10 and verse 30, Jesus used the parable of the individual traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thieves. Okay? That was not something that was striking to this people. That was something that was usual. Furthermore, the inns, quote unquote, were known for prostitution and immorality. Paul taught because of this the importance of Christians being given to hospitality. Romans chapter 12 and verse 13. Peter captured the idea and says in 1 Peter 4:9, use hospitality one to another without grudging. You'll see why, in a moment, they would have the tendency to grudge. And when you read in Romans chapter 16, you find many individuals whose hospitality enabled Paul to continue his ministry. In fact, there's a lady named Phoebe who was a succorer of many and of myself also. She was a helper to many, including Paul. There were ladies in Romans 16 as well as men who played an instrumental role in Paul's ministry because they sought to meet his needs. They provided hospitality to him, and we might even say that Paul's ministry was enhanced by these individuals. But hospitality extended far beyond the provision of giving them a place to sleep. Now, think through this. Many of the rooms, or many of the homes, were constructed as single-room dwelling places. So an individual comes and you simply give him, and there would be a little raised place oftentimes. That's where he would be able to sleep. Sometimes houses had guest rooms. In that case, they would typically have a member of the family sleep with that guest because it was regarded as discourteous to leave a guest alone. What do we want? Well, typically we might have hospitality for a while, and then it says, okay, just leave me alone at this point in time. I'm ready to go to bed. Now, it goes on because meals were often to be provided, and they were often quite elaborate and formal. In fact, both during and after the various courses of the meal, entertainment would be provided. This could come in the form of readings. It could come in the forms of music and dancing. And when all of this was done, there was significant time that was devoted to just sitting there telling traditional stories from memory. You know why Peter said use hospitality without grudging? Makes sense, doesn't it? Having the right attitude. This widow whom Paul describes here has developed a reputation of a lady who would house strangers. She would be involved in the extensive work of hospitality. Just simply cooking a meal was far more laborious than anything you and I encounter today when it comes to cooking meals. She extended this hospitality, and I think we could add to that with a proper attitude. In addition, she must have also washed the saints' feet. This would be a task generally reserved for a young servant and was often regarded as a lowly task. The willingness to perform these tasks would demonstrate humility and a willingness to serve others. Jesus exemplified it in John chapter 13, grabs a towel hours before his arrest and eventual crucifixion, and then he begins to wash the feet of the disciples. And he explained this in John 13. If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, ye ought also to wash one another's feet. And when the Bible uses that word ought, we generally think of this would be a good idea to do. When the Bible uses that term, it's an obligation, a debt to pay. For I have given you an example, he says, that ye should do as I have done to you. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent me, or than he that sent him. Fourth good work of this qualifying widow would be that she has relieved the afflicted. She's come to the aid of the afflicted ones. How were they afflicted? We don't know. They were oppressed in some way, but we do not know the exact way in which they were oppressed, nor do we know the extent to which they were oppressed. But these individuals came upon hard times. Now, let me just caution you, because 1 John 3, and we'll get to this in one of our Sunday morning messages. It might be a little while before we get there, but the Bible says in 1 John 3 that what about the believer who sees his brother have need, and he has the means to be able to meet that need, but he just says, oh well? John asks the question, how dwelleth the love of God in him? Sometimes we come across people who are going through hard times. Our tendency is often very calloused and cold. Well, stinks to be you. Boy, I sure am glad I don't have that problem. But you know what this lady does? This lady goes to those kinds of people's aid. What a challenge. Generally today, don't bother me with that. Or we'll throw the spiritual approach. I'll pray for you. We need to be careful how we respond to those who are going through hard times. This lady was known for coming and seeking those out and trying to meet their needs and provide them with the aid that they needed. Finally, she was to have diligently followed every good work. And it would suggest that she applied herself with eager devotion and dedication to every good work. Well, we could conclude, I think, from this final phrase that the list in verse 10 is not an exhaustive list, but it would be used to describe in this phrase here any good deeds that were not specifically mentioned. She's devoted herself to the pursuit of these kinds of good works. Now, as I go through this and I wonder, okay, well, is the focus exclusively on these 5 items, or is the focus more on her character? To me, the issue is more on her character. There are types of people who could engage in these types of behavior, but yet do so with the wrong motive. Her lifestyle was a lifestyle that was characterized by serving others. Her actions, whether they were included in this list or not, would be favorably reported by others as being service-minded. That was her character. Is it fitting that the church provide her with needed assistance? Well, you take a widow who's over 60 years old, who has no outside resources to help. She's lived a life of moral integrity, and she has exemplified selfless devotion. She's qualified to receive needed assistance. You see, we're not looking at things subjectively. For the most part, we're looking at things objectively. This is who she is, and she's lived a life that demonstrates this pattern. But I also have to point out in closing that if this kind of a widow were qualified to receive assistance from the church, a widow who did not live that kind of lifestyle would not be qualified, regardless of her age and regardless of the perceived needs. Interestingly, that rather than being included in a group receiving assistance, a widow who was not qualified was to be rejected from that group. Doesn't mean that she's ostracized from the church, but she does not meet the requirements for financial assistance or for assistance from the church. The leaders of the church had a responsibility then to ensure that only those who were qualified received the needed assistance. And he's going to get into this in verse 11 because there are some that the instruction is to actually refuse, to reject. You ever been rejected? You ever been told no? Have you ever been the one to tell someone else no? How well does that work out? Typically not well. Do you think feelings might be hurt? There's a distinct possibility. And we might look at something as cruel and heartless because these people have needs. Do you know what God says? Don't do it. In fact, doing so would actually be poor stewardship if you did it. And it's interesting to see how he develops that argument in verses 11, 12, and 13. And that's exactly what he ends up doing. These ladies' character is vastly different than the ones mentioned in verses 9 and 10. Now, we're talking about widows tonight and those who are needing assistance from the church. Obviously, these are qualities, however, that ought to describe every one of us. Imagine as believers, if you and I resolved to live every day with a selfless mindset of serving others. I wonder what kind of testimony we'd have. It sure is a whole lot easier to share the gospel with someone that you've served selflessly than it is to share the gospel to someone that you've been a jerk to. It doesn't work out so well. What a challenge for us to take these kind of character traits and just simply try to implement them into our own lives. And I think if we do so as believers, we'd all be better off.